Of course, today is just an introduction. It's very brief to kind of give an overview of working in research with Indigenous communities, and there will be probably more questions after than you even have now, and so of course we have lots of time after to have some of that dialogue as well. I want to start by first acknowledging the traditional land on which we gather, and to thank those who have come before us, who have been stewards of the land here to make sure that we are able to safely and productively gather here today to meet and to do the great work that many of us are doing here at CAMH. Just a very brief kind of introduction to who I am. I'm originally from Labrador. My family is Inuk, and I'm a member of the Ngunnawal Community Council. Toronto is a very different place to live than Labrador, though I'm from the urban town. There's 7,000 people, so that's a little different. I mean, that the context of urban there is certainly quite different than it is in Toronto. I wear many hats as a researcher and evaluator. I do lots of things like advocating and writing and working with Indigenous people, kind of at this intersection of research, education, policy development, and the delivery of healthcare and health service. So all those things kind of are together in some way, and sorting out how we can work together in that space that sometimes seems a bit messy, or sometimes seems like we don't really know how to work through it. Many of us around the table here are working at figuring out how to make sense of that sometimes messy situation. So when we consider intersections, of course, all of us are going to be restricted by funding agencies, government priorities, people who from other places are telling us what the priority is for us to be doing within our jobs at places like CAMH, at universities. Of course, we're fit within a structure of what is a priority, but then often if we're working in communities, that may not be the same priority, or those priorities may not align. What's important in a community may not be the same as what's important for us to be curious about here in Toronto. And so sometimes we think of intersections as being kind of just these two roads that converge, and even that alone sometimes can be complex in understanding how we sort out moving through that. I kind of liken my intersection to looking a bit more like this, where there just really are so many factors at play, and there isn't a blanket approach. Sometimes people come to these kind of sessions hoping to leave with a checklist of their little process to do to make this all work better. And for those of you who have already worked in Indigenous context, you know that there isn't a prescription or a way to do it. There's lots of ideas and suggestions of what may work in one community, in one project, in one way, but certainly then to not apply that to everything that we're doing. So the context for some of us who work in this area as Indigenous people who are also clinicians or researchers or service providers or whatever other roles we may have, we find ourselves kind of in this precarious place between two worlds. So not only do those priorities and policies and all those pieces sometimes contradict each other kind of at a community level, it also does for us as individuals, right? When we're trying to work within these systems and these institutions that can be very counter to how we understand things. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that disconnection between Western and Indigenous science kind of as we go through here today. I want to draw your attention to this article. It's written around doing some work in youth leadership, but the title of it really spoke to me around when we follow our hearts, we provide that path for others. And we see this often in Indigenous communities where it takes that one champion or that one person to kind of lead the way for people, and then we're able to learn how to start doing that together. And of course, I want to remind people that as important as it is for us to follow our heart in doing this kind of work, that we remember to take our brains with us, right? And so that we're able to somehow sort through that messy space. The kind of theoretical or conceptual framework that I use in a lot of the work that I do in kind of bridging these gaps between Western systems and Indigenous systems of knowledge is this concept of two-eyed seeing. So this was coined by a Mi'kmaq elder in Nova Scotia named Albert Marshall. And basically what this talks about is the integration of Western and Indigenous science together as one. So not as two separate entities where you just do one or the other. It's about sorting out which bits from both those knowledge bases can complement each other and work together. So on the one side, we have what many of us face in our work as clinicians and researchers and scientists. It's very competitive, right? It's egocentric, it's driven, it's about me, about one individual and how you kind of work through that system. It's based on things that are very assertive and theoretical. It's, you know, that kind of science-driven approach to how we're understanding things. It's very empirical. If we can't see it, it must not be real kind of notion. Then on the other side, from Indigenous perspectives, it's much more holistic. So this notion of individuality is actually just not even in most of our understandings of how communities work, because it's much more collaborative and collective. And then in that, we use a more principle-based approach of kind of those human elements and understandings of truth and honesty, wisdom and humility. And then it's actually the bringing together of both of those worldviews that we're really best suited to be able to understand what it is we're working on, to find solutions to problems that otherwise seem impossible to find solutions to. And so again, it's not about a competition. It's not about Western and Indigenous science-based being in competition with each other. It's about finding the parts of both of those that really can complement your work. And I remember one time hearing Albert Marshall talk about these kind of knowledge bases and knowledge systems, and of course spirit and the spirituality is very important to Indigenous people, and so he talked a lot about that. And then he mentioned, you know, the Creator makes no mistakes, so there's even a use and a value for Western science. You know, so like he's making this, because from Western science perspective, we look at Indigenous science and knowledge as being, it's different, we don't understand it, sometimes it seems mystical or even magical for people because they just don't understand. And so then from Indigenous perspectives, we look at Western science kind of with that same lens, right? So then how can we bring these two worlds together? I want to give a bit of context because I'm not sure where all of you are coming from, so if some of this is a repeat, I apologize, but I'm imagining for some it might be relatively new information. So historically, and even up to today, which can be quite challenging because it still happens in 2017, that Indigenous people are often looked at in research in a way to be exoticized or romanticized, or like to be sorted out to figure out what's wrong with them, or to all of these things that are imposed on Indigenous people. And this is often done without Indigenous input, and so we have non-Indigenous researchers who, for lots of reasons, sometimes very well intentioned, to discover or to find or to articulate something about Indigenous people without actually knowing the context in which that sits. And so I think this is true of any kind of work that we're doing. When we take a piece of information out of context and then spread that message without understanding how that fits, that can be very problematic, not just for individuals, but for entire communities that we're working with. Another big challenge in research for Indigenous people that has really kind of pushed this movement from the inside out for Indigenous people in governing their own research is around dissemination. So we're getting better at having partnerships happening kind of at the beginning of projects, but then towards the end we start to notice it's really then hard to keep that engagement happening. So sometimes researchers may come back, but then they'll provide a very academic, scientific presentation to a community. I've sat in on some, and I am an educated person and still kind of had no idea what people were talking about. So certainly then that's not engagement. That's like a one-way, it's not even a conversation. That's just talking at people about things that doesn't even really make sense to them. And then of course we look at data more generally, and this, I'm not sure how well the lighting is here for you guys to see this, but you know, this guy in the front saying data's free, it's open to everybody, I promise. But if anyone's ever tried to access data or information, we know that it's not as simple as just like picking up the phone and then someone gives you your information, right? It's a long process, and so this notion that it's just free and open is not true. And so I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about some of the movement from Indigenous communities to ensure that we actually do hold and control our own data in doing that work. And then perhaps one of the biggest reasons why we still need this work to happen, building these relationships with non-Indigenous and Indigenous people, is because too often there are proclaimed experts in Indigenous health or education or whatever the case might be who are non-Indigenous people, and again may not have that context to be able to say what's actually happening, right? They may observe something and then report on it. They preclude to themselves that they are the experts in this area, but in fact may not have that expertise. And so especially now, I mean, many years ago, perhaps there weren't as many Indigenous people who were in these positions to be able to do this work, but now there are. And so it's important that we learn how to work together in doing that. And then perhaps most importantly is this notion that research is relational, and that all of my research is all of my relations. And this one can be tough for researchers, because of course, we can't look at all things, all variables in every single project we do, right? We have a very specific question, we have a hypothesis, we're looking at something very tangible. However, for Indigenous people, we don't artificially compartmentalize everything that way, right? Things are actually much more integrated and more connected. And so while we understand that, of course, a research project can't look at all things, it's important for researchers to understand that that is the perspective that many of our participants will have. And so how can we negotiate that space in between the two, where we're looking at something very specific, one very, very specific question, yet to the people who we're working with as participants will see that as part of a much larger picture that we can't really even wrap our heads around, right, from a research standpoint. And then just to give an example that's brand new from just yesterday, actually, on APTN, Ian Mosmy's been doing work for a while around some of the medical experimentation that happened during residential schools and in the Indian hospitals around that same time. And so we're starting to see that perhaps some of the things we've been kind of claiming as quote unquote truth in the past while, even this example here around diabetes, perhaps our line of saying that this is a genetic issue or this is all these other things could actually be linked back to some of the malnutrition and the different things that were happening to Indigenous people throughout the course of the residential school. And so again, this is kind of information that's continuously being uncovered in research and how we are working in and with Indigenous people. So I kind of want people to get see the bigger picture and how all of this works. And so to do that, I'm going to take you back just very briefly to 1996. And it was in that year that the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, they finalized all of their reports. It was about 5 years in the making, all kinds of time, energy, resources, and all those things that went into producing this commission. One of the biggest recommendations that came from this was this notion of a renewed relationship with Indigenous people. And I'll remind you again, this is from 1996. This is the same year that the last residential school was closed. So we saw that that was happening, and we were all alive in 1996, I think. I don't think any of you are like really putting us to shame here and being that young. And so that's kind of what's happening here in Canada around that time. And then globally, we've been seeing in the last few years the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which also reasserts Indigenous people's inherent right to self-governance. And that includes research, that includes program development, that includes education, that includes all of these pieces, healthcare delivery, the things that all of us are working in. It includes the governance of that. So I mean, we know that federally speaking, we're not quite there yet in implementing this, but it's something that we should all be aware of in our work as researchers and clinicians. And so then in Canada, of course, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the past few years that also speaks to many ways in which Canadians can be doing differently in working with Indigenous populations. About 6 months ago or so, I saw this guy tweeted this, and it was just perfect because like early in the 90s, we were hearing about RCAP, the Royal Commission, how that was going to be a game changer for the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. Then in like 2008, we saw that around the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And then just a couple years ago, we were saying the same thing about the inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women. And yet what we find is that we're constantly saying one thing and doing something different. We're really not walking the talk that Canada in general is very good at speaking. So what I'm most interested then is how we can align those two together, that the words that we're saying actually match the actions that we are doing with the people around us. And so I got in on this kind of work around ethics and methods for Indigenous people quite a while ago, and so many people were just like, what are you doing with a philosophy degree with this and that? And nothing made sense to people, but I always felt like there was a reason why this was important work. And so I want to share a little bit about the ethics development and how this kind of unfolded in Canada. So it wasn't until 1998 that there was any policy for any research involving humans. This is not Indigenous specific, this is for all humans. And then around the beginning of the 2000s, we start seeing a movement within Indigenous communities to produce their own research ethics boards, research review committees, research protocols. And so a couple here, one's in Quebec in the Ganawagi Code of Ethics. They were one of the first to kind of formalize all of theirs. It originally started with a research project around diabetes, but they've now built a whole code of ethics that they use for any kind of work in their communities. And then I'll draw your attention to the three that are in yellow. The first one is OCAP. Curiosity's sake, who's heard of OCAP before? Good, I've got lots of work to do. Excellent. So those are the OCAP. The OCAP principles are ownership, control, access, and possession. I'll talk a bit more in a moment, but these are from the First Nations Information Governance Center as an inherent way for Indigenous people, First Nations specifically, to be able to govern research that happens in our own territories. Then in 2007, CIHR actually released guidelines specifically for research involving Indigenous people. But then very shortly after, the new Tri-Council policy statement came out, which had a chapter on that research, which meant then the CIHR guidelines kind of went to the wayside, which is unfortunate because a lot of Indigenous people felt like they really contributed to the development of that policy or of those guidelines, and are a little concerned that their language was kind of lost in the TCPS2. Yet the TCPS2 is what governs us to do this work. And so I kind of came in around during the draft consultations of those CIHR guidelines, and then haven't been able to stop geeking out around ethics ever since then. So I always love it when people come and listen to these sorts of things. So when we look at the TCPS as a whole and all of what it kind of describes to us and how we conduct ourselves as researchers, the focus is very much on the individual. And this is true of, if you look anywhere in the world about research ethics policy and guidance, it's about how we protect individual participants in research. And so that's based on the same kind of foundational principles, right, of autonomy to beneficence, to do no harm to your participants, and around the recruitment and justice in that work. When we look, though, at Indigenous ways, and to use OCAP as just one example, there are about 80 or more very rigorous community-based processes in Canada, and obviously we don't have time today to talk about all of them, so just for simplicity to look at OCAP as being kind of one of the major drivers of this work. The focus moves away from the individual and is now focused on the collective. So of course, individual is still important. Individual consent, individual confidentiality, all the things that you still look for an individual is important. And now you also consider those things for a community. So is there something in your research that may implicate a community, culturally, socially, politically, ways that you might not understand because you don't have that context? So it's not just about individual protections, it's also about collective protection in research. And so that's then based on a much more principle-based approach of respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. And so this is kind of that foundation then of how we build relationships with Indigenous communities and people, so that we ensure that the work we're doing is meaningful, not just for us to get whatever we might get, if it's a new degree or a publication or a promotion, but also so that it's actually having meaningful impact in the community that we're working in. Of course, many things have kind of driven this movement for OCAP to even exist. First is this history of research relations, and while I only talked very briefly about that, that itself could be a whole course on why we even need this kind of policy to begin with. Then there's been a big increase within our communities with both capacity and interest for research for a long time, and even now, I mean, certainly I still have many family members who just kind of glaze over as soon as you say research or ethics or methods or any of that stuff, because it just doesn't seem applicable. But when you start to realize that actually people have been doing research for a long, long time, like how did we know how to navigate the land? Knowing where the caribou are, or knowing how to go with the ice, like all of those things, and understanding weather patterns, understanding how the universe, the moons, all of these things, right, actually is research, just that people don't necessarily have that same language. And then certainly at the core, the most important part of it is around self-determination. So Indigenous people ought to be the ones who decide what research happens in their communities. We set the priorities. It ought to be Indigenous-led, not community-based, where you maybe get one support letter or you do something that may be considered community-based, but that actual, real, meaningful stuff where it's a collaboration and we're actually working together in a meaningful way. So I'm not going to get into all of the details about OCAP, because again, I think perhaps that could be its own lunch and learn session for us to kind of dissect that a little bit. But just to briefly touch on it, the ownership part is that So first of all, it's a little challenging with ownership of data, right? Because do you own it? You collect information from me as a researcher, but now do you own that? Or do I still own that? In Indigenous communities, again, back to this idea of collectivities, the community owns it. So just as we assume, like, I fill out this survey and give to you, well, I mean, that's technically mine. Well, then in a First Nations community, that data belongs to the community. And there will be different types of structures in place for that. Some will have a chief and council that goes through, some will have an ethics board, some will have a research board. There, again, no one way of doing it, but that it's owned by the community, not by the researcher or the institutions in which we work. The second is around control. And the same idea here is that our communities ourselves are the ones that control the research agenda and control what happens to the information once it's collected. Sometimes this might not seem like a huge deal when it's around, I don't know, we're doing interviews around specific kinds of tea or something that seems kind of minimal risk and perhaps not super challenging. But when we think about clinical trials or genetic research or any of these other forms of health research that can get much more complex, then what happens to that information is actually quite important. So if you're collecting biological samples as a researcher and then you just decide what happens to that when you find something very curious, perhaps, in your analysis that you weren't necessarily looking for, you didn't have consent from the community to do that, and then you still continue to go. So one of the ways that OCAP tries to mitigate that is to have this control mechanism in place where the communities ourselves decide which parts of that you can actually do that work with. Then the A in OCAP is around access. And so just like I mentioned earlier about this notion of free access to your information once you've given it, whether it's verbally or written or however that might be, certainly we know that that's not an easy process. And so the access in this process is so that Indigenous communities can access that information whenever they want to, without all of that red tape, without all of the time and all of those pieces. A way that this is often negotiated with researchers is through a research agreement. So you would have these conversations up front about what that looks like. What does it look like now that we've collected the data, and whether it's electronic data that you now have on servers or whether it's physical data, biological data, whatever your data might be, what mechanism will you have in place with your team to ensure that this access part is done throughout the whole process? And then finally, skipping ahead. Finally, the P in OCAP is around possession. And so this sometimes may mean physical possession of data, and sometimes it doesn't mean physical possession of data because of limitations or restrictions within communities. Like, I know a lot of the work I do in Labrador, we don't have the infrastructure for broadband and for all of these things to be able to house a lot of electronic data. So we've built a relationship with the university in that province where they house it physically, they have all the servers with our stuff on it, but then we have a research agreement that talks about the ownership, control, and the access. And then instead of possession for the final P, we talk about protection, because that part's still important. Even if we're not physically housing the data in our community, we still need to make sure that it's being protected and that other people at institutions, so in this one, I mean, this is a huge hospital that we're working in. Lots of people have access to lots of things. Even if technically they're not supposed to have access to these things, it's easy to make mistakes. It's easier for people to find themselves in a place that perhaps they're not supposed to be. And so making sure that we have these mechanisms in place that we can protect the data that's being collected from our community so that it's not then just kind of being out there for people to do what they will. So I wanted to talk a bit about the TCPS2 and OCAP to just kind of give you this sense that the very foundation of how we approach research is different because it's from an individual to a collective space. And so if we look at things individually, we see humans, us, again, as this egocentric being, right? We're in the middle, and then somehow the rest of the universe is around us. But in collective ways of understanding, humans are just one part of that. We're not at the center of it. We are part of nature. We're part just like the animals and the plants and the elements and all those other pieces. And so that interconnectedness actually shifts how we understand research because it's not about ego. It's not driven by individuality, right? It's about collective and how we do that in moving forward. So for a lot of people, they feel like this. I get this from students especially all the time who just feel like whichever direction they try to go in is the wrong one. They've tried 100 things and they get no for an answer and they don't know what to do in moving forward. So one of the things that we've tried to kind of put together in helping sort through this is this notion of a research GPS. And so in this context, GPS is guiding principles and strategies. Because unfortunately for us, Garmin does not make a moral GPS where we can just like type in our coordinates and ask if what we think we're going to do is the right thing to do or not. And so instead we're left with our good old moral compass, you know, the what's right and what's wrong. And I know that I don't speak any other languages, but in speaking to many of my Indigenous friends and family and colleagues who do hold their language, there isn't words for ethics and research and these things that we talk about in this way. But the closest thing to ethics is to do the right thing and to be true to yourself. And so, like, I think that makes sense. That's how our Western understanding of ethics is too. But how much do we actually do that in our work? We might typically try to do the right thing part, but the being true to ourselves, I know as an Indigenous person, I find that very challenging sometimes, working in different systems and structures, to be able to be true to yourself and to still maintain that kind of relationship with the institution that you're working in. So these strategies and principles then are again based on these 4 R's: respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. And I mean, I think they're relatively straightforward in what these words mean, but at the same time, applying them can sometimes be challenging for people. So even with reciprocity, making sure there's ways built into your project that benefits the community. We know communities don't expect that every research project will have these amazingly glorious outcomes with really tangible benefits. We know that that's not how it works. However, maybe you come and you're really great at, I don't know, video editing. Well, what a great skill that you could help teach some folks in a community around video editing. It might have nothing to do with your brain scan research that you're doing, but it's still a very tangible way to give back to a community that you're working in. Sometimes researchers think that the benefit has to be just from the research project, and of course we can't promise that. We can't promise ever that any of our research projects will have any kind of grand outcome. I mean, we all hope that, right? We all hope we're the researcher that's going to like do that really cool thing that's going to make that impact, but it might not. So in the meantime then, what can we do? What can we do while we're there to make sure that we're giving back something, not just extracting all the things from the communities, whether that's knowledge, health data, biological data, whatever that is that we're collecting. We can't just keep taking without giving anything back. And then of course all of those 4 R's it's all about the relationship piece, right? If we start actually building that relationship, these other parts will start to fall into place. Like any other relationship, there's going to be some challenges. There'll be points where you are butting heads and you're not sure how to move forward. But that's part of it, right? If we look at any of the relationships we have in our lives that are valuable to us, they've taken time to build and they take time to maintain. You can't just build it on Tuesday and then you're done, right? There's work that you need to keep doing and moving forward to make sure that that keeps happening in a good way. So even within the TCPS and others, it's very clear that we talk about Indigenous people being embedded within our relationships to the bigger picture, right? About the natural and the social world. Again, we can't continuously artificially compartmentalize everything. Not everything can be fit into a little box separate from other things. One of my favorite Indigenous researchers, he's an epidemiologist in BC, he said at a talk recently, we want to be at the table, not just on the menu. And I love that because I feel like especially in the last 10 years, Indigenous anything is a very hot topic, right? I mean, almost everywhere you go, we're hearing people talking about Indigenous affairs, Indigenous issues, Indigenous communities, yet often there aren't Indigenous people around those tables talking about what we actually do in moving forward. So to kind of sum up what it looks like in the TCPS Chapter 9, to give you the very Coles Notes version, this one slide sums up for you what TCPS Chapter 2 is asking us to do. And you'll see here that it really is about partnerships and relationships. It tells us a lot of the what to do. It really doesn't give any guidance on how to do it. So this is one of the ways that you can start building your relationships with your communities, to ask them how. How can we start doing this? How can we apply policies that work like this in our communities? And so 3 of the underlying questions that are kind of in the TCPS2 and in a lot of the work that we're doing in Indigenous contexts. First of all, how can research even proceed responsibly against this backdrop of colonialism and inequality, especially when it's institutions like this one that are leading that kind of research? How can we make sure that it's done in a responsible way to the communities that we work in? And then, I touched on this briefly. Where does the paradigm of individual consent break down and why? And what implications does that have for you in your research? This is, again, right, perhaps another whole talk just on consent and how that works in a collective and an individual way. And then finally, what is the role of community involvement and in research? And so when we look at all of these, we kind of start seeing it's back to these three very basic things: self-determination, research, and relationships. And so what then I think we're all tasked to do here is to sort out how we start making sense of putting those things together, right? We kind of know, I think for the most part now we're starting to know, but how do we fit them together? Some of the work that I've been involved with in Labrador has really been trying to integrate these four pieces: the funder, the research ethics board, the researcher, and the community. Because there needs to be some shift happening in all of those areas in order for us to be able to do this work. For any of you who already do research, you know that there's a lot of restrictions on you from your funder, and you have to have all kinds of ducks in a row with your ethics board before you can get any of your funding released. That can be actually damaging to communities who are working in a community-based participatory way, because that means there's no upfront communication, there's no upfront design. You've already got your ethics approval before you even go to their community, which for a lot of communities, they will say no to you, because that means you've not actually engaged till now. You've still sat in your office in Toronto and designed a really great study, but have never actually made that connection before. So in some of that work, what is some of the things that we learned? I guess I want to share with you one of the key things, which is this idea of the consent model. And so for most other research, and certainly if you've done REB submissions before, you know this is what it looks like. It's a very linear process. You have your brilliant idea, you design your project, you write a proposal, you get your REB, you do all that work, and then after all of that work is done, then you will go to a community and perhaps seek some guidance, hopefully get some community approval, and then continue about your way. But of course, we realized before we even started doing research on research that that wasn't the approach that people wanted to take. And so we learned very, very quickly that it's much more circular model that includes a lot of back and forth, and you sometimes might get stuck in that messy bit in the middle. So the only part that stays the same is you can have your brilliant idea. Researchers get defensive with me often when I tell them this, and no, you can still have your idea, but just please don't run with it until we actually have a conversation, because maybe your idea doesn't align with the community, and we don't want you to waste all those brilliant ideas when then nobody actually wants to partner with you in the project. So have your brilliant idea, but then step one is to have a research agreement. This looks different again in all communities. Sometimes it's a conversation, and then you just, you have a good faith agreement that this is how it's going to work. Sometimes it's a one-pager that says researcher will do these things, community will do these things. Other times it's a long 20-page legal kind of document, and anything in between, right? So there's lots of ways that we can produce these research agreements. They all start with having the conversation between researchers and communities about what are our expectations from each other, from ourselves, what roles do we play in doing this? Because there's roles on both sides, right? This is not just, the responsibility is not all on us at CAMH. We also have responsibilities in our communities to speak up and to speak out and to be part of this kind of work. And then you do a proposal together and first get community approval. Before the REB approval, the community approval comes first. And if you have an REB, whether it's at this institution or a university that you're at that tries to challenge you in that, please send them to Chapter 9 of the TCPS, where it very clearly states that community approval comes first. That this is new for people, even though the TCPS 2 is 7 years old, so really by now we should start sorting out how to apply that. But since 2010, it explicitly states that community approval comes before the REB approval. So if we look at both of these side by side, we see clearly that in this bottom scenario, the community is left out of half of it. Half of the design of the project, communities are not even engaged in. So for that reason, it's very clear then that Indigenous communities and most organizations prefer that we use this more holistic model where we're coming in at the beginning. So if it's not clear to you yet, then it's all about relationships when we're working in Indigenous communities. I have a couple of examples that I won't go into detail, but just to kind of, if you want to make note to look, the CIHR Institute of Aboriginal People's Health have a framework that they've developed with communities, policymakers, and Indigenous and academics to kind of sort out how they're working in that context. We also have some other stuff here in Ontario that you can look, and again, you'll start noticing some of the similarities in that they're holistic models, that they integrate family and self and community within all of it. It's not just about individuals. And one of my favorite engagement models, this is from, I think it's New Zealand or Australia, sorry. On the one side, they have their traditional plants and ways of understanding things from a traditional way, and then they've placed them in congruent order with steps in the research process. So they've made it very locally context specific in doing this. And so they had a lot of energetic buy-in from the community for that reason, because people felt like they were part of that work. And then a little closer to home here in Ontario, Cancer Care Ontario also has the Aboriginal Path of Wellbeing, and you can see here the same kind of notion of this integrative care throughout the lifespan that includes things I talked about earlier, like respect, truth, humility, wisdom, all those pieces built into that. So all of those together is about building the relationships. And one of my favorite quotes from an elder back home in Labrador was, I mean, and this was like a whole rant that he went on. Like there's like probably 2 paragraphs long, but the essence being that research really ought to be a marriage, not a one-night stand. And so this notion of flying in and taking what you want and getting out of Dodge just really doesn't cut it anymore. And so the way that people in these communities have been describing it is that we have to go beyond the consultation process. We hear this often, right? There's a duty for us to consult with Indigenous people on matters that impact Indigenous people. We don't even do that very well as a whole, the consultation piece, but certainly that's just one part of what we have to do. Then we also have to make sure that we're doing that in a way that communication is accessible in what we're saying. That again, it's not super academic science that only people in your discipline actually understand, right? I mean, even people outside your discipline, even if they're as educated as you, may not understand what you're saying when you start speaking in the jargon of your discipline. Then there's the ways of finding the cooperation. Where are the ways that we're actually aligned? So sure, there's parts that are different, but then there's some things that are aligned. And then finally, it's around the consent piece. And again, not just individual consent, but collective consent and what kind of implications that have. And it's then all of those together that talk about collaboration. And collaboration isn't just about like gluing random ideas together. Like we all come in here now and we leave and we call this a collaborative meeting, but I've only talked at you for 50 minutes. Like that's not really collaboration, right? It's like we actually have to work together, and there's ideas that never even existed before until we all got in this room together and then started sharing. That's what collaboration is. I want to kind of wind down with this quote from one of our participants, and I feel like this is so common for people in the research ethics process. What do researchers really mean by partnership? Is it a tokenistic partnership where we just say it on paper but actually have no say in the whole process? Do we get to challenge it? Do we get to veto it? What happens if we disagree? What happens if a community says A and the researcher says B and you're already partway through? Then what? Does the researcher just say, well, thank you for your opinion, but I'm going to do what I want anyway? Or do you actually have a dialogue and decide how you can solve that problem? Right? I mean, there's different ways of doing this, and certainly for a lot of people in communities, they feel like it's sometimes tokenized. They feel like people are saying partnership, they're saying community-based, they're saying participatory research, but they're not actually doing those things. And so it's important that if we say we're going to do something, that we're actually doing it that way. And so some of the benefits of doing this kind of collaboration, of course, we have this community relevance and responsiveness. I like to remind researchers that without participants, we have no project. So when we go into communities with our attitude of thinking we know what's best when we really don't know what's best, and then community says no to us, it doesn't matter how brilliant our idea was, right? Because there's nobody to talk to. There's nobody to collect data from. So then your brilliant idea just sits there on a piece of paper. And of course, this knowledge sharing and mobilization is a huge piece that happens in this kind of work. And this is not a one-way street. This is not just researchers and scientists and clinicians building capacity or teaching Indigenous people. It's also reciprocal. It's both ways. Clinicians and researchers get to understand and learn from Indigenous people about how to do things differently in their practice and in the work that they're doing. And then, of course, there's ways to be creative in collaboration, right? We don't have to stick to some of those old school methods and ways of doing things. We can challenge the way that that's been done and instead produce things that are much more open and accessible for people. Of course, those benefits don't come without their challenges. One of the biggest ones being the cost, time, money, energy, resources, all the things. It's costs more for all of that. However, with all of that upfront cost, it then yields a longer term sustainable relationship. If we make this investment, right, it's an investment upfront. to do this work, to build a relationship. And then once we have that, we can start then doing all kinds of work together in moving forward. Another challenge can often be the reconciling responsibilities, understanding whose responsibility it is to do which things, what roles do we have to play in this, and then that can get challenging, because if your job is a researcher at CAMH, then your job's a researcher at CAMH, but if your job is a frontline social service worker in a community, research is the side of your desk. That's not your day job, that's not what you're, I mean, it might be really interesting and a priority, but there's also 20 other priorities. So learning to manage those responsibilities can be challenging, along with the priorities. And so then some of the opportunities in collaborating with Indigenous communities is, of course, having locally relevant data that actually could have some impact, rather than just making blanket statements and blanket approaches that really don't have any specific value. Again, the reciprocal capacity building, learning from each other how to do this work. And then evidence for communities to be able to leverage to get more program money and more things to actually solve their community-specific issues. So there's a kind of a continuum of community engagement in research. We often see Indigenous people being expected to be participants and facilitators and even directors and all these things of research. We also expect them to do that for free and to just be like a volunteer in the community. But more and more we're starting to have this kind of fourth one here, the advisor and the assistant, where we're hiring Indigenous people and training Indigenous people to be able to work with us to collect this data. And then the long-term goal, of course, to have research offices in our communities. What's exciting is that the grassroots voices are getting louder. Indigenous communities all across the country have been really mobilizing in the past decade or so to build these community-based approaches for us to be able to navigate this system. And so, to remind you, of course, the relationships are really the most important part. And it's going to seem like sometimes it takes a lot of energy and a lot of time. But again, this investment up front in building these relationships really are the thing that's going to make you be able to go on the trajectory that you are wanting to go to. So trying to see the bigger picture then in what our responsibility is in moving ahead. First of all, we think about equity in service, right? If we see here, if we give everybody the same, well, we still don't necessarily have equitable treatment in doing so. I think that the third option is one that we should be considering, especially in positions that we have here, where we actually are addressing the systemic barriers that have caused us to need all of these extra things for equity and equality. And if we actually start addressing those barriers and challenges, then we won't have to spend so much effort in those other parts. And so I think we often have this notion, we do the best we can till we know better, and then when we know better, we should be doing better. But what I've noticed is that many of us get stuck in this place of knowing better but not doing better yet. So I think we often find ourselves in between. So I want to leave with a few things that we can do now to start actually doing better in this work. This is to summarize a few of the things we already talked about. Using a strength-based approach. Let us not only look at all the deficits and the things that are wrong, but also focus on some of the things that are going well. How can we learn from communities? So like one example I like to give is around suicide. We hear often around communities with really high suicide rates, and this is true. Also true, some Indigenous communities have virtually no suicide. So what happens in those communities? Why are we only focused on the deficits rather than looking at places that are doing things really well? Secondly, addressing those systemic barriers. And this is something we can all do in our jobs. Poke by poke, little by little, in all of the things that we're doing. We can resist the way that these structures are built so that we can make sure that we're creating something that's actually inclusive for the people that we're working with. Using that principle-based 5 R's: respect, relevance, reciprocity, relationships. And build the relationships, participate in the community. Don't just show up and wonder why nobody comes to your focus group when you're just like a random person who's never been seen before. Enjoy what's there for you to see. Maybe there's events, there's restaurants, there's concerts, who knows what's there. Enjoy it and become part of that. On the more technical side for research, I encourage all of you to check out this website, First Nations Information Governance Center, and probably stay tuned. I'd say that we may do an OCAP kind of lunch and learn like this one at some point for us to get more familiar with how this works. Same is true of the TCPS online. They have modules for Chapter 9. Some of it is pretty decent to help you kind of work through how that works. And so I'll end off with just a very few things. First of all, if you change nothing, nothing will change, right? So we'll end up just be sitting back in this circle, who knows when, a year from now, 2 years from now, and still be all the same thing. You often see this. when you say, who wants change, right? We want change. Everybody, put your hand up. We want this. We want things to be different now. But then when you ask people who wants to change, not so many people put their hands up, because it seems like it's just easier, right, if it's somebody else that does the changing part. So I mean, my challenge to all of you then is that we all take on that responsibility to change a little bit of what we're doing. And so in doing that kind of change, we don't have to wait to like break down the whole system and start over and figure out how we can do it. Small things within these big structures actually can make quite a huge difference. And one of the ways for us to do that is to be authentic, right? For us to actually be true to ourselves. So back to this notion of authenticity and ethical relations with Indigenous people. Remember to integrate multiple ways of understanding in the work that you're doing. This is especially true in the context of Indigenous people. There are multiple ways of understanding. There are multiple truths. And there are multiple ways of sorting out how to make sense of what we're doing. And of course, one of the greatest lessons for me, and it's hard to do in a world that is driven by time, is to live your life by a compass, not a clock, right? So to not be so constrained by what time it is and where you have to be, but to rather know the general direction of where you're going and to be less worried about those kind of things. And then to kind of let go of the notion that success looks anything like this, because I think we probably all know it doesn't look much like this. And in fact, it looks a heck of a lot more messy and like this. And I think we all find ourselves in this middle space of trying to sort out how we're getting in that general direction. I will encourage all of you to, in your work that you're doing, to make sure that you're not doing work on Indigenous people, that you're doing work with Indigenous people, and that you don't do anything without us. We're all over the place now. I mean, it was years ago, pre-Google and pre-all that stuff, perhaps it was harder to find, right? But now we're here, and it's ways that we can all do it. And in doing that kind of work, be reflective in what you're doing. You know, like understand the position that you bring, whether that is intentional or not. We all have bias. We all have things that we bring to the work that we're doing. And so it's important for us to be reflective about doing that. I want to remind you that there are multiple ways of getting to the same thing. So while we see, 5 plus 2 is 7, so is 3 plus 4, and so is 1 plus 6. So just because there are multiple ways of getting to something similar doesn't mean that one or the other is wrong. Are you going to tell little Billy that no, 5 plus 2 is not actually 7 because I think it's 3 plus 4? Like, are we going to have that argument? No, we're actually coming to the same outcome, just it might be different ways of getting there. And so ways that all of you can kind of come to us and we can help in doing this kind of work. This is from our website. You can see that Aboriginal Engagement and Outreach. Part of what we're doing here is to help build these relationships and collaborative partnerships here internally and with external folks in the communities. We are guided by 4 directions that are helping us strengthen our practice and partnership with Indigenous people and communities throughout Ontario and throughout Canada, in fact. And so those are, of course, building this internal capacity so that we are able to meet the needs of our communities in a way that's meaningful to them, improve our collaborative partnerships between folks like you and folks who are outside of CAMH, and making sure that our clinical care is culturally responsive and that we're not applying blanket approaches to work without understanding context. And then finally, to be able to support the capacity development and knowledge exchange, again, inside CAMH and externally. So I will leave you with this one thing, and I mean it seems kind of hypocritical for me to say this since I've been talking at you for this whole lunch hour, but it really is better for us to listen rather than to talk. We have 2 ears, 1 mouth, learn to use them proportionately. We actually might learn something if we listen, right, rather than just reiterating what we already know by talking. So with that, I will say thank you very much, Nakumik, for your attention.